Hello and welcome to another issue of our UEF lunch debate, today dedicated to the exciting opportunity of a new convention process. Of course, we will include Italy's election and the right-wing developments in Europe into that. In this year's State of the Union address, the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, expressed her support for the revision of the European Treaties following the European Parliament's resolution of June the 9th. But what does that mean in concrete terms? What are the next steps? What is a possible timeline? What agenda should the convention have? And of course, what are the positions, demands and ideas of the Union of European Federalists that might impact the whole convention process? I'm looking very much forward to profound answers from our political experts today. Julian Plottka and Daniel Freund, thank you both for being here with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for the invitation.
So I have the opportunity now to say a little bit more about you so that our participants can get a feeling where you're coming from and your expertise is coming from. Julian, you're a political scientist and research associate at the universities of Passau and Bonn, a lecturer at these and other universities with focus on EU institutions, their reform and democratic legitimacy, on civil society and EU citizenship. You're also a consultant for EU politics and education institutions, for example, in the area of European integration. You have been with the Federalists for 13 years now, and you started with the JEF Europe, later were a board member of the Europa Union Berlin, I have to say that in German, and for 6 years now you are a member of the Federal Committee of the UEF. Daniel, after leading the campaigns in Transparency International's EU office, you became a member of the European Parliament in 2019. Your focus is the fight against corruption. You fight for the rule of law and for a better future of Europe. As an MEP, you are also a member of the Committee on Constitutional Affairs. For the Conference on the Future of Europe, you have been the Greens EFA representative on the executive board and had a good look behind the curtains of the conference. You are president of the Spinelli Group. As you all will know who are here, this is a group of about 70 pro-European Federalist MEPs. And in this role, you also organized meetings for all pro-Europeans during COFEU plenary meetings. So you have been also studying, in your case, politics, economy and law in Leipzig, later public affairs in Paris. Yes, as I said and mentioned before, for whoever joined in now, please turn off your microphone and camera as we are recording. You can write your statements and questions into the chat or post them afterwards directly via raising your hand. The discussion will last for about 45 minutes and then we have 15 minutes for Q&A. All right, let's dive into our topic. Julian, the first very basic question goes to you as a university lecturer to prepare the field. What exactly is meant with the European Convention and what process are we talking about? What impact are we talking about?
Yes, thank you. First of all, if we talk about the European Convention, that nowadays refers to Article 48, Treaty on the European Union. That's the article which defines how the European treaties, which are the de facto constitution of the European Union, can be amended. And since 2009, so since the last treaty reform, there is the ordinary revision procedure, which includes the European Convention. And this European Convention is an assembly of members of the European Parliament, members of the national parliaments, the head of state of government, and also representatives of the European Commission, which is convened by the President of the European Council. And this assembly shall adopt by consensus recommendations to reform the treaties. In the past, we had two examples of such conventions where the outcomes were quite successful. So the European Charter of Fundamental Rights and also the treaty establishing a European Constitution were drafted in such conventions. And so looking at the outcome of both previous conventions, there was a decision to include this kind of forum into the treaties as an ordinary revision procedure to amend the treaties. And shall I also go a little bit more in detail in the process?
Yes, please.
With regard to the impact question, I think it's quite easy because in this reform process, everything is on the table. So every character in the EU treaties can be amended. There are no limits. So you could say you can abolish the European Union by this process, as well as turning it into a United States of Europe. In some member states, that's something different. There are probably constitutional limits to what governments can agree afterwards in these reforms. However, in these there are no limits with regard to the to what the European Convention can propose. If you look at the process, I would try to separate it in 4 steps or 4 phases. First of all, you have an initiating process where EU institutions need to kick off the process. This can be national governments, the European Parliament, or the European Commission, and the European Parliament has done this summer. They triggered Article 48 in a resolution, so this initiating treaty change phase has already started. As a next step, the Council has to act, and that is where the process is currently pending, because the Council has to inform the European Council as well as the national parliaments about this idea to reform the European treaties. This has not been done so far. And after this information, the European Council can decide by simple majority to start the reform process itself. Before taking the decision, it has to consult the European Parliament, which is obviously very much supporting the reform process, and also the European Commission. As you just said, Ursula von der Leyen said in the State of the Union speech that the Commission is also supporting this, so that shouldn't be the problem. I think the key issue we're looking is a Council and the European Council who is not willing to continue with the process. And after this decision, the President of the European Council, as I said, convenes the European Convention, which is then the second phase of the reform process. And there are quite very few procedural provisions in the treaties so far. So you just have the composition, which I explained, with national and European members of Parliament, representative of national governments, and the Commission. And additionally, if there are also issues related to the common currency on the table, then the European Central Bank is also consulted in the European Convention. And in the treaties, it just says that recommendations should be adopted by consensus. So there's no voting procedure, but beyond that, the internal structure is decided by the European Convention itself. In the past, we had a plenary. This was this example of 2004, which drafted the treaty establishing a constitution for Europe. So they had a plenary and also working groups to be more efficient. And what is more there in the treaties is that the result or the recommendations of the European Convention are addressed to the international conference, which then itself adopts the reform of the European treaties. This is the third phase, saying that representatives of all member states convene in these international convention, which is a kind of international international conference outside the European treaties, because the European treaties are international treaties between the member states still. They are not, that's why I said in the beginning, they are de facto the constitution, but they are so far legally not similar to a constitution, but an international treaty. And these heads of the heads of state of government, or before they can agree, normally the foreign ministers or other representatives negotiate on the proposal by the European Convention. And if they adopt in consensus, so there's real unanimity in this case, that the treaties shall be reformed, we have the fourth phase, which is the ratification. And here it depends on what national provisions say. Roughly, I would say in most member states, these are ratifications by parliaments. The only exception for sure is Ireland, which will have a referendum. And also in the past, the Danish government was of the opinion that the Danish constitution says it needs a referendum. However, with regard to the Lisbon Treaty, they changed their mind and said if it's not a major reform, we can also do it in the parliament. So at least 26 parliamentary votes and or most likely 26 parliamentary ratifications, and for sure one referendum. This is a 4 steps process.
This is quite a complex process. Thank you very much for delivering that to us. As we remember, 2004, we already had something like a European constitution, and it was only France and Netherlands who blocked its ratification in those referendums that you were talking right now about. So the question here to Daniel, are the times now better or even worse for opening up structural negotiations about the EU? Could we lose something even because taking into consideration the recent election in Italy and other anti-democratic and authoritarian developments in Hungary, in Poland, and other countries in Europe?
Hi. Well, thanks again for having me. I would say that, I mean, we're basically still living with those rules, right? That were written in around 2004. And since they entered into force, we have seen the financial crisis, we have seen migration, we have seen Brexit, we've had Corona, and now war has come back to the continent in a way that I think few of us imagined even a few months ago. And I think, yeah, it's about time to draw the lessons from this whole series of crises, right? The world is a different one than it was in 2004. And I think the European Union needs to take that into account. The way to do that is a convention, is treaty change, to do this properly. Now you might argue, a crisis is not the right time, but when in the last few years have we had a moment without crisis where we were all just sitting around idle, ready to have constitutional discussions? And I think many of these crises were actually harder on Europe, on the European Union, because the treaties aren't fully fit for purpose, right? So yeah, I think it's about time that we have that debate, and it's not just me, and it's not just the entire European Parliament that thinks so, but we have actually called the Conference on the Future of Europe precisely to prepare this next step, right? Because if you look at the conference, it basically already included the convention, the players that Julian described were all there. We complemented that with citizens and civil society representatives to initiate that debate. And the result of that 1 year long debate on how the future of Europe looks like, or should look like, was, well, that everyone in the conference, we adopted the final recommendations by consensus also in the conference, was a number of recommendations that do require treaty change. And I think particularly the last 6 months since the full-scale Russian invasion in Ukraine have shown that unanimity is something that we need to talk about in Europe. It is simply too dangerous that foreign policy decisions, sanctions decisions are taken still by unanimity, and that basically one single head of state can block or incapacitate the entire union. And to turn it the other way around, from the point of view of Vladimir Putin, he needs to turn around one by bribes, by threats, by whatever tools he sees fit. But if he manages to turn one, then the EU basically doesn't even have a position anymore, let alone do we take sanctions decisions or anything. So yes, I do think it's about time that we have that conversation on changing the EU treaties.
But as you say, it might not be easy to really come to an approval from all sides because there might be interferences. Thank you so much. Julian, in 2017, 2018, you already researched the interests of the member states in reforming Europe. Your research project at that time was called The Relaunch of Europe, Mapping Member State Reform Interests. So we talk about interests that come more from the state side, less from the civil society side, as the COF-EU was providing. What at that time did the member states wish for changes to reform the EU? And do you see any big differences to member states' wishes of today?
Yes, thank you for referring to this project, which we commissioned conducted at that time. In general, I would say the answer is that at that time and today, member states don't want to reform the European Union. I think at that time and today, they're really afraid of, they often say, afraid of opening the Pandora's boxes. However, if you look at different policy issues, they are much more supportive of having specific reforms done. So I think that's a trade-off we right now face, that on the one hand, the governments are quite skeptical, and the problem is, as just described before in the process, that they are right now the bottleneck, so they have to agree to go further with the process. However, they are quite skeptical and don't want to open the negotiations. On the other hand, if you go into the policy issues, you see that certain governments or certain member states, sometimes also depending on the election, so with the changing governments, the positions sometimes change, that they are really supporting specific reforms. For example, social policy, economic policy in the south of Europe is an important issue. Right now, defense union was in 2007, 2018, more a special interest of experts discussing that. So nowadays, it's really at the forefront of the public debate, and especially Northern and Eastern European countries are much more supportive of having reforms here. And so if you go through the different policy areas, you would always find support. I think the best example here is even the common European asylum policy. I think all member states would agree that it's completely a mess. However, as there is really unlikely to find a compromise between all 27 member states, so the reform has stuck for years. From this side, I would say, on the one hand, I would be rather skeptical that it's possible to trigger off the process. On the other hand, I would say there is a lot of potential for reforms, as there are specific interests of many member states. And if I also maybe add to the previous question, comparing the last EU reform and the current situation, I think one similarity is there, which is right now looming on the horizon. If you remember that basically the last European Convention was triggered by the Eastern enlargement. So in 2000, the member states negotiated the Treaty of Nice to make the European Union fit for the enlargement of additional 12 member states. However, the Treaty of Nice failed, so the compromises found there were insufficient, and the next process was the European Convention. And nowadays we have committed to Ukraine and Moldova as a prospect candidate countries, and I think German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, as well as Ursula von der Leyen, made clear that this is a package. There won't be enlargement without reform. And so I would say this could be maybe the trigger or the political, could have enough political power behind to kick off the process. And then you have these different special interests among the different member states where you can find indeed compromises. So some social policies for the Southerns, some defense policy for the Eastern countries. In the end, not everyone will be happy with everything, but there is leverage or discretion to find compromises.
So you see realistic chances for several points to go through, several others to not go through. I see our first comment / question in the chat. Thank you for that. We will come to that a little bit later when it's time for Q&A. I will remember where it refers to. And I would like now to dive into all the proposals of the European Federalists that you made actually during the COFEU phase. You had a proposal for a stronger and democratic Europe, and as a civil society organization, you could really bring them into the COFEU process, the Conference of the Future of Europe, and they should and hopefully will be taken into consideration in the constitutional process. And there are three major demands or points that the UEF pointed out. The first one is the recognition of the European Parliament's direct right of initiative on legislative matters, and the recognition of the Parliament's full co-legislative rights on the EU budget. This is one point. The second point is the reinforcement of the competencies and powers of the Union in areas such as health, energy, climate change, defense, social and economic policies. So that's a huge demand. And the third point is shifting from the unanimity rule to qualified majority voting in all European policies by extending the ordinary legislative procedure. I would like to take a look at all these 3 points one by one, because I think then it's easier to discuss them a little bit. Daniel, I would like to ask you first, and from now on, please just step in one and the other whenever you would like to add something. Julian, Daniel. Daniel, first question, the recognition of the European Parliament right to initiate legislative matters and to co-legislative rights of the EU budget. Is this realistic? Is this doable? And how would it change the EU's functioning?
Well, I think that this has huge support in the European Parliament. I guess that's no surprise. We are the only parliament in the European Union that doesn't have this, that is not allowed to initiate legislation. And I think, the European Parliament is not a full parliament, not a fully democratic parliament until we have that right to initiate legislation. Sorry, Ursula von der Leyen had actually kind of promised us the right of initiative when she ran for Commission President, but the reality right now is different. At the end of the day, though, I think it's also a bit up to us in the Parliament to make this happen. Ultimately, we have political control over the European Commission. On paper, we can force the Commission at any moment to give us this right. Otherwise, the Parliament can dismiss the Commission, right? So it's in a certain way also a power relationship between the institutions. And so far, the Parliament has not pushed hard enough for this. Obviously, it's better to do this by just simply do treaty revision and write it into the treaty. But if the member states block that road, it is something that the Parliament could de facto create simply by forcing the European Commission. I mean, if legally speaking, the right of initiative remains with the Commission, when the Parliament says we want this or that, then the Commission can simply enter it into the process.
Might there be any rejection from member states against that change?
I mean, there's, as Julian has described, there is at least a sizable group of member states that has been quite reticent of treaty change, and there is also member states government that see any kind of additional strengthening of the European Parliament as something that they don't want. Viktor Orban has even, as part of the Conference on the Future of Europe, has come forward with a proposal to basically abolish the European Parliament, right? So there are those views out there as well among some governments.
Thank you very much. Let's come to the second point, the reinforcement of the competencies and powers of the Union, which might be creating even more resistance in areas such as health, energy, climate change, defense, social and economic policies. Julian, how do you see the realistic and doable steps towards more power to the Union? Is it realistic? How would it change the EU's functioning?
Yeah, that's really a difficult question, because if you talk about reinforcement of competencies, so you really have to look into detail about what you're talking about. So if I understand reinforcing about adding new competences to the European level, that first of all would mean that we really need to have the ordinary revision procedure of the treaties, because all the simplified procedures do not allow to give additional competences to the EU level. And if we have first of all looked to the political resistance against the reform process, I think giving new competences to the supranational level is for many member states governments really of symbolic importance, because they want to protect their sovereignty. They don't want to give additional competences to the supranational level. And what is really quite strange from my point of view is here that the debate is more around this symbolic transfer of competences, and it's not so much about whether it makes sense to have this competence on the European level or not. For example, a couple of weeks ago, I discussed with a member of the European Parliament from a Eurosceptic political faction also this issue about the transfer of competences, and we came to the issue of energy policy. And there, I think he was from an Eastern European country, and there I would say Eastern European countries would be quite heavy if the EU would have supranational competences in energy policy, because up today, the member states still decide on their own how they where they get the energy from. So they choose their own sources of energy. If we look at the current situation, the EU took a decision to reduce the dependency of Russian gas in the past. The only member state who didn't do it was Germany. However, as the EU does not have a competence, so there was no way to rein in. And so some of the really skeptic member states would probably be very happy if the European Commission would have had real leverage to rein in German energy policy. And so I think we have to, on the one hand, the real problem is this debate about the symbolic transfer of competences to the supranational level, where many governments say they don't want it. But what we have to do is really to look into the details, the specific issues which are at stake, and then probably compromises become possible. And we do not have such clear lines of Eurosceptic and pro-European member states, but it should be about policy and indeed having a better policy. And so far, I see a little bit the debate turning that it's not so much more against reform or non-reform, but the question is what we want to do with these reforms and to get the reforms done, the reform process kicked off. I think it's more to discuss about what can be done, and in most cases, it's really important to reform the institutions to have more policy results achieved in Europe.
Daniel, do you have any ideas as member of the European Parliament what exactly could happen, how these competencies could be widened, what powers concretely could be given here to the Union?
I would say two things. Well, the first one is, I think, particularly on energy, it could not be clearer to everyone right now that we need to coordinate, right? That facing the blackmail from the Kremlin turning off our gas, that if everyone tries to face that by themselves, it will mean chaos, it will mean hardship in large parts of the European Union, and ultimately will give a win to Putin that he shouldn't get, right? So our only chance on this is we do together, where we show solidarity with one another and we face this together. For that, we need coordination. What does it mean to give a competence to the Union? Does ultimately mean we coordinate and we decide together how we face this. The other thing I would say in general on this debate of transfer of competence, that always sounds like the member states are actually losing something that they're then giving to the Union. And I actually don't think that they are losing anything, because that member states can still regulate something like climate change or the taxation of large multinational companies or something is an illusion. Even if, I come from the largest member state of the Union, if Germany decides tomorrow we go climate neutral, we haven't stopped climate change. If Germany tomorrow decides we're going to tax Apple more than the 0.05% that they currently pay on the billions of profits in the Union, Germany just simply cannot do this alone. Right, because we are a European market and capital moves freely and so on. So in a way, national sovereignty on many issues today is an illusion, and that is true for migration as well. It's true for our security towards Russia or China. So the member states aren't actually losing anything. We're only winning when we're trying to actually face those global or continental challenges together.
Makes a lot of sense. So let's come to the populistic resistance, perhaps, with addressing the third point of the proposals of the UEF, that is shifting from the unanimity rule to qualified majority voting in all European policies by extending the ordinary legislative procedure. It sounds like you said, Julian, already, that the sovereignty, this is something like, all those right-wing populist parties will address simply as a keyword to just keep the nation sovereign, no matter what it actually means in really achieving solutions. How would you say, whoever would like to answer first, what would happen if anonymity rules not anymore? If anonymity is shifted to qualified majority, what would be different in the EU, and what kind of burdens, hurdles, blocks have to be passed to achieve that? Is it achievable? Is it realistic?
So if I can start, Julian, I mean, first of all, populists, autocrats, they love the veto, right? No one has been using it more than Viktor Orban in the past few months, and not to defend whatever the national interest of Hungary, but basically for his own personal interest, right? To get concessions, to get additional money, whatever it is, or to do the bidding of the Kremlin when it came to certain sanctions. So obviously, it's not easy to achieve this. You need unanimity to get rid of unanimity. But I think there is three factors that really increase the chance to get there. The first is we need a broader reform package, because, I mean, Julian alluded to it already. The Czech presidency has just done a questionnaire basically to the 27 member states and asked them which areas, which kind of decisions could you imagine going from unanimity to qualified majority. And there are areas where we don't have unanimous support right now, but where a larger group of member states actually can imagine that. But the majorities shift depending on where you look. There's different countries that can imagine it for taxation, or others for foreign policy or sanctions decisions. And I think there is a bargain to be struck there somewhere where, one gives it up in one area, and for that another country gives it up in yet another area. The second factor that helps is money. It facilitates compromise finding. We have seen that time and again in the past. We need common investment regardless in the current crisis. So I think if you have money, it also increases the chance that we can find a deal. And the third aspect that I would mention is, at least in those fields where it's possible, let's reflect if a group of member states can move ahead. Not that I want necessarily that we only move with a smaller group, but we saw when we made that deal between the 7-year budget, the Corona Recovery Fund, and the rule of law conditionality, which I negotiated for the Greens, there was a veto from Poland and Hungary against that package. And it disappeared the moment that there were loud reflections on possibly doing the Corona Recovery Fund without those two countries. So sometimes just the legal possibility can then create agreement by everyone else. So I think I'm not saying it's easy. But I'm saying with those three factors in mind, we can increase the chances. And just to complement what Julian said earlier, that it's, right now there is a larger group of member states that doesn't want treaty change. If you would have asked the question about treaty change 2 years ago among governments, I think there was not a single one that was open to treaty change. And today, it depends a bit on where you look exactly, but I think we have about half the member states that are quite open to the idea of a convention, of reforming the treaties. So it's about finding the right package now, the reforms that find a broader majority. I'm convinced there will still be some governments, and I know Viktor Orban will be difficult to convince on any of this at the end. But I also know, I still have hope that he's not going to be there forever. And one day there will be a new Hungarian government to negotiate with. There might be a new Italian government in the meantime as well, but basically halting the discussion already before it has even started, because in one member state or the other there's currently a government that might be skeptical, I don't think is the right approach for the European Union as a whole.
So you would see it quite positively. The common crisis actually is giving us a window of opportunity, because the need to act, to mutually act, would be a logical argument for most of the governments. Julian, would you like to add something on the point of unanimity? Or shall we? Yes.
Maybe I can directly complement to these three factors on sovereignty, money, and moving ahead with differentiated integration. With sovereignty, I think it's important to keep in mind that's at least what research shows, that most of the member states are not really capable of following all issues in the Council. Because everyone's had the impression that the Council with a veto is really the instrument to protect national sovereignty. However, if you look in research, you find studies that a number of smaller and medium-sized member states simply do not have the capacity to follow the negotiations. So they simply cannot use the veto, because they not really are aware about what is going on, because they have so limited resources in their national governments. They have to highly select which issues are important for them. So there they negotiate. However, most of the dossiers in the Council they do not really care about, and so the instrument is quite useless. So I think we really have to be honest here that this sovereignty and the veto instrument in the Council is probably not that important, and there are other instruments in the where national governments have to change things to have more influence on the European level. The second point is that that in the past, when in new areas qualified majority voting was introduced, we did not have a change from doing it by consensus to having votes all the time. If you look per year, there's just a very limited number of qualified majority votes in the Council. So you still have this tradition of consensus. And so I don't expect that will change in the future. However, the real value of not having unanimity is really to have such rascals who just want to block EU processes. You can threaten them to do qualified majority voting. However, with most interests, they will be still incorporated, as I don't expect this culture of consensus in the Council to change. So I think the sovereignty argument really has to be put into perspective. The second, maybe to add to the second facilitator, money, I think this has to be seen from two sides. In the past, it was always the argument that the big member states, basically Germany, would spend money to get European integration forward. And so to facilitate compromises in the negotiations. However, currently we are at a point, if we look where people propose to spend more money on basically defense or common infrastructure, be it in the energy area or be it in the transportation area, I think these are European projects where it's quite likely that European investments will save a lot of money. So even the biggest member states will probably save money by doing certain things on the European level and giving more money to the European level instead of doing it on the national level and commission smaller projects on just the national level. So I would fully agree with that. And finally, also with the moving ahead with a small group, that is what you really could see in the past, and that's also an outcome we had from the study, the relaunch of European member state, the relaunch of Europe mapping member states' interests, that we found a core of the founding member states plus Spain, which were really interested in going forward in a different number of policy areas. And also we then proposed that they should go forward, but assuming that they will be able to take more member states on board. For example, before the opt-out of Denmark in the defense policy was now abolished, Denmark was really afraid of being left behind in defense policy. So they did a lot of projects on small scale in the area of defense because they were afraid of being left behind. And Poland was really angry about being sidelined during the Euro crisis because they were not part of the Eurogroup. And there you really can see that this instrument of
dear Julian, at least I cannot hear you anymore. Hello, hello. Is it
Sorry,
only
can you hear me?
Yeah, now, but I think the connection is a bit disturbed.
Is it disturbed or
now it's working. Would you please repeat what you said?
Sorry for that. I just said that I fully agree that you will get other member states, hesitant member states on board if you threaten them to go ahead. However, in the long-term perspective, we probably have to also think about that maybe not all of them will go on board. So probably if we look at Hungary, maybe we really have to think about differentiated integration in the long term, having a large core which is integrated with a second row of member states which are not willing to participate in all projects.
So this might be a real option to have two different kinds of measures of integration for different countries. I would like to pose one last question before coming to the question of the next steps, actually what will happen next, and then it's open for Q&A. So my last question would be about all the other classic UEF demands like transnational parties or even a constitution. Will they find a way into the discussion or are they opted out? What is happening with all those demands that are there for years now?
Well, the question of transnational lists, at least, I mean, the European Parliament has made a proposal for an electoral law, a bit like the proposal for treaty change. It's lying in the council and waiting to be dealt with. And I have to say, I mean, it's just such a shameful example of how European democracy doesn't fully work yet. You know, we in the Parliament, with a large majority, make a proposal how the elections to the European Parliament should work. Across political groups, we agree this is the way that it should be. And now the member states' governments, it seems, are not allowing this to happen when they have no direct. This is not because it's too difficult for them to organize or whatever. It's they don't even fully justify why they don't allow this, but the current rules are that they have to approve unanimously the new electoral law, and it doesn't seem to be happening, and the window of opportunity is closing, because if we don't have a deal by the end of the year, it's pretty much impossible to have this for the next European elections in 2024. And it's a shame, right? Why aren't we allowing all Europeans to vote on the top jobs a bit more directly, and having a European constituency, where whoever wants to be Commission President can run and see who gets the most votes? But it seems that member states have no interest, or not enough interest, at least, to allow this to happen.
Thank you so much. Julian, the last question from my side to you, then we come to the Q&A. Considering Ursula von der Leyen's really clearly declared commitment to the convention at the SOTEU, what happens next? Which steps are there to be seen? In what time frame? How does that look like? Quickly, if possible.
Quickly, okay. Yeah, I'm a more a skeptic because personally I'm not really convinced that this support for European Convention by Ursula von der Leyen in her State of the Union speech was really a political commitment to pressing for that. The next step is in the hand of the Council. So the Council has to inform the European Council and the national parliament that the European Parliament has triggered Article 48. There's the political dispute about whether this has has really happened, this triggering of Article 48 or not. The Council says it hasn't happened for formal reasons.
Actually, they have, I mean, there was a question mark at some point, but that is gone. They have officially replied by letter. It has been triggered. We're good.
Okay, so the next step is that they need to inform the European Council and the national parliament about that, and then the European Council has to decide to start the reform process. That was the formal. That would be the formal process which is now following if the Council accepts this triggering of Article 48. Which is then really one step further. However, we just saw that the problems in the member states remain, and so far, as I understand, those countries like Germany who are in principle in favor of treaty reform, they prefer to do it like passerelle clauses, so not having really a European convention. So now it would be really important to have the political pressure, which is there from the European Parliament. However, it would be really positive to also see it from the European Commission. Here, I'm more skeptical that we will see from the European Commission as much engagement as we see from the European Parliament, and also civil society here, especially UAF, should continue to push for the treaty reform or treaty change, but not just on the supranational level with the EU institutions, but also to lobby the national governments to open the way in the Council.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I think it's a perfect time to go now to the question of the chat. Eva Lichtenberger, former MEP herself, she wrote, do you see any movement inside the Council in favor of a convention? You just said yes. How are the majorities in the Council actually? Would you like to answer that question? And the second question of her is, how do you see the outcome of the elections in Italy? Will that impact the debate strongly?
So where exactly the majorities in the Council lie is still a bit of a question mark. So the Czech presidency actually asked this to all the governments, but I haven't seen the detailed results. They have made a general note, which is still confidential to the member states, but they haven't given sort of, this many countries in favor, this many opposed, and this many don't know yet where they stand on the question. But I mean, you basically you saw it at the beginning and also at the end of the conference on the future of Europe. There were about 12 or 13 governments that also came out publicly quite hesitant, towards treaty reform, at least in the immediate future. There is, as I said, in the beginning there was no country. Now there is a number of countries that are quite positive on this. The new German government is among them, but many as well. The question at the end will be, how large a majority will they want to see to actually start the convention? Even if they can get the 14 countries that are necessary, I think there might be some that argue, well, if it's it's maybe not a good start for a convention to have a 14 against 13 vote in the Council. That would be reasonably divisive. But I also think that it's necessary at some point to decide that now we do this. What impact does the Italian election have? I mean, I'm quite afraid of what this new government led by Meloni might do and might look like. She's really not known to be a pro-European. I fear, if I look at her past track record, she is somewhere between Mussolini and Orban. That doesn't mean anything good for EU reform, European democracy. We'll have to see. But as I said earlier, I mean, for me, the building of the European Union, cannot be impacted by just one government in one member state. We all know the statistics, how long Italian governments on average stay in office. Let's focus on the debate in the wider European context. And one member state in favor or against at one moment in time shouldn't derail the entire process.
Thank you. So let's open up now for Q&A. If you would like to raise your hand or write a question, a comment into the chat. Alain did this. He wrote, why don't we, and I think with we he means UEF, have clearly a complementary treaty for member states who want to go on for a political integration? So just let's have a proposal for those who want. What would you say to that idea? Whoever would like to comment on that.
Yeah, maybe. I just said, yeah, basically that is the idea behind differentiated integration. So if you threaten the other member states unwilling to reform the EU treaty, that you go ahead without them. If you talk about issues which need treaty reform, the only option is to go for a new treaty outside the existing EU treaties. So we had that with a fiscal treaty during the crisis, where the British government wouldn't sign up for treaty reform. And so the fiscal treaty has become a new international treaty outside the European treaties, even though EU organs or EU institutions participate in this treaty. And so the credible threat to have a general reform of the EU via differentiated integration is probably this way. Otherwise, you still need the consensus of all EU member states, even to a differentiated model, if you want to do it according to Article 48 and reform the existing treaties.
Thank you so much. Alain, you raised your hand, I think. I managed. Yes, your microphone.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So it was my question. So I was listening. So I don't understand quite well. It's not a problem for other member states if they don't want to go on political integration. And I don't understand quite well why it is not possible to have a complementary treaty. I say complementary, that means the other one, they just have what we have today. But we just creating a group of member states who want to go further without disturbing the other ones. They don't want. So perhaps it's avoiding some Brexit on one side, and more important, it's not blocking the political integration and all these politics we want to have at the federal level.
Thank you. Daniel, perhaps you would like to shed a perspective on that.
Well, I mean, you can solve certain issues that we have with such a complementary treaty. Others you cannot. We cannot abolish unanimity by complementary treaty. We cannot give the European Parliament a right to initiative or a proper European election with transnational lists by complementary treaty. And even extending the competences, I mean, we talked about energy, we talked about health, maybe defense, even that. I mean, there's some stuff that can be done, but it also has its limits depending then on which countries are in and not. I mean, if you think about, for example, building a renewable energy grid or high-speed rail or something, I mean, you can't do that between Spain and Germany if France isn't in it, so to speak. It will simply be, you can't connect the two. So yes, some stuff can be solved like that. Other issues.
Alain, you would like to add something?
Yes, just one point. Okay, I can imagine all the problems, but there is an advantage too, which is to have a real coherence with the people, what they want. Because in this case, in each country, you will have the necessity for a citizen to choose if they want to go on with the United States of Europe or not, and they are free. They can stay aside, they can wait, they can come later, and the other one, they want to go, we just go.
The
problem of public opinion is very important for me. It's a way to have a more coherent link between citizens and decision at the level of Europe.
Yeah, so exactly. The problem is a bit,
but I think it's a point. If we go on this way, we will never go on with the real solution we need, as you explained, for many reasons we know, and we will just go on with not to do.
Thank you, Alain, for your really strongly felt, and we can emotionally really agree to that, your proposal to let those people go if they want to go. Daniel, you would like to add something, and then I would like to pose our last question for today.
Just two reflections on that. Well, one is the biggest disadvantage, basically, of doing treaties outside the EU is there's no role for the European Parliament. And I generally think that our European democracy works better if the Parliament, the directly elected representatives of citizens, are in the decision making. And I'm not sure what you said, that each citizen then really has, through their national government, a say, because we see from polling that there is big support for the EU, also for things like a link between money and values, even in member states like Poland and Hungary. Yet the governments of those countries do something very different. They're not pro-integration, they're not pro-defending our European values or democracy. So I would question whether that direct link between citizens and governments, when it comes to decisions about the EU, always works perfectly. So those are my question marks. I still have hope, actually, that we can reform the Union through the process that we have in the treaties. But maybe I lose that home one day, and then we have to go by another treaty outside the Union.
Well, thank you so much for our discussion so far. We have 1 minute left. It's time for your closing statements. And I would like to ask you, in this case, about the convention process, Daniel, Julian, what are your biggest concern and what is your greatest hope? So one each, please. Whoever would like to start. Julian.
Julian, go first.
Yeah, what's quite easy is my greatest concern. I would say my greatest concern are national bureaucrats who are really hesitant because they don't dare to decide. That's really a big obstacle to EU reform, that so many concerns are raised on the national level, and I think here national governments have to be more political and do what on their political agendas are, and less on the technical issues. My biggest hope is that we will be able to kick off the treaty reform in the next 5 to 10 years, I would say, and I'm really afraid that the reform pressure from upcoming crisis with Ukraine right now is so big that it's probably not a question whether we will have a treaty reform. The only question is how soon will the political pressure be so big that there is not any resistance anymore against it.
Thank you. Daniel.
My biggest fear is that we wait too long, and there's a price to pay in the meantime. And my biggest hope is when we do the convention, that we learn from what we have done during the conference, that we have citizens around the table, that we have civil society around the table, that this is not just a behind closed door meeting of government representatives and a few constitutional experts, because then I also think, if citizens are involved throughout the process, and that's what we have tried in the parliament to organize so far, then we will also have much better chances to get this ratified in all the member states, and not to run into a problem like last time with the referendums in France and in the Netherlands.
So that might be the hope you have if we include citizens in time, not afterwards. Involvement process would make a yes more, realistic. Wonderful. I thank you so much for being with us today, Daniel and Julian, and all of you, dear participants and guests. I hope to see you again at our next lunch debate. It will be a Tuesday again in 2 weeks on October 11th at the same time, 12:30. And I guess we will address the fight of democracy against autocracy and Italy in particular. But let's see what happens until then. And for now, I wish you all a good afternoon and see you again.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.